Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing Sri Lanka. And we know ever since the Easter Sunday bombings especially, there have been a number of policies undertaken in the country which may be seen as Islamophobic. And the latest of that is a ban on burqas, which has been approved by the cabinet, the Sri Lankan cabinet that is, and will very likely also then be signed into law by the government itself, considering it does have a majority at this point in time. Now, the reason for this burqa ban is national security concerns in the wake of those bombings, certainly back in 2019 as well. Burqas were banned for a while in the wake as well, again, of such violence and extremism. The Minister of Public Security has in fact called burqas a sign of religious extremism and said that the ban would in fact improve national security overall. Muslims make up around 9%, I believe it is, of the Sri Lankan population. Is this the best way to go about ensuring national security? Certainly, yes. If there is an issue of needing to identify somebody, I'm sure there are ways around it, apart from just banning the burqa altogether, which, of course, as some women may choose of their own free will to wear in Sri Lanka as well. Let's discuss those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Ruwan Uduwarage Pereira, who is a senior lecturer in criminology and policing. He's also an expert in civil rights matters when it comes to Sri Lanka and the UK. He's joining us today from London. Also joining us from the British capital is Shakir Nawaz, who is the General Secretary of the Council of Sri Lankan Muslims organizations in the UK. He's a business consultant and lecturer as well. Shakir and Ruwan, thank you both for taking your time out today to join us. Ruwan, let me start with you. Is the reasoning here, national security, a good enough reason to ban burqas?
I think people very easily bandy the term national security around, and I believe that the people of Sri Lanka have a right to be told what is the evidence. What is the evidence? Is there evidence to require this? Now, as a former police officer myself involved in issues such as counterterrorism and equality issues in general, I can simply not foresee, without the evidence, a rationale to support this.
Shakir, what are your thoughts then about this? If there is no rationale, as Ruwan there said, at least what's come out publicly and shown to the public, what then is the reason? Why do this?
In Sri Lanka, recently it has come to Muslims have been targeted in many ways, starting from, as you all know, about the forced cremation issue. And now it has come to where the Islamic institutes, madrasas, were banned. More than 1,000 madrasas were in fact going to be banned. And a lot of movements has been already banned. And now the next step towards was to targeting the Muslim communities, a sentimental issue, which was a burqa, which is going to bring a lot of chaos and anxiety amongst the Muslim communities who were living in Sri Lanka for over 1,000 years and enjoying all these freedom for expressions and following the rights of human rights on these issues. And now suddenly the government changing because of the power which they want to try and keep amongst and satisfy the majority, and putting up this particular issue in front of the majority community to win their minds and hearts, maybe to control and to be in the power for some times. Whether it is done according to the consensus of Muslim community, there might be some concerns and issues pertaining to the security as claimed by the public security minister, Sarath Weerasekara. But is this the right approach? And we heard 1 month ago, the cabinet spokesperson suggested that it will be not rushed and it will be according to the consensus and proper consultations. Just before the UNHRC resolutions were passing, these were discussed, and suddenly in 1 month's time, it has been tabled for the cabinet approval has been taken. So this doubts how it can go ahead amongst the Muslim community.
Ruwan, if the genuine concern is national security, as somebody who has worked in policing before, I would think that there are methods around just an outright ban. Am I right to say that?
I would certainly suggest there is, and I would suggest that Sri Lanka also needs to reflect on its own constitution, where religious freedom is at the core of the Constitution. And I note even reading up on it for this interview, the amendments from 2020 and into 2021, the Constitution has not changed that. This fear factor that arose after 9/11, 7/7, and then obviously in Sri Lanka in 2019, apologies. There is no evidence to support this widespread fear. And I question I question all aspects, and I think the people of Sri Lanka have a right to question all aspects of this proposal without seeing any evidence. And frankly, there is no evidence to suggest that female members of any community disproportionately commit acts of violence. In fact, that's untrue.
Shakir, what does this then do to the Muslim community in Sri Lanka? Because of course, this is not the first such measure which is targeting Muslims, especially again, as I said, after the Easter Sunday bombings. But even before that, possibly there have been measures also taken. Through this targeting of Muslims, what does that mean for their place then within Sri Lankan society? Are others now viewing Muslims as a threat?
I mean, Sri Lankan Muslims were a very peaceful, love to live, were living for centuries and over 1,000 years, as I told before. And this particular incident, this particular ban or targeting Muslims recently with various approaches makes alienating Muslims communities amongst the majority Sinhalese. Now, we were having a wonderful relationship with the Sinhalese, and there was a time that most of the Muslims were supporting and during the wartime in Korea, being in the forces and intelligence services and everything. But now the majorities view Muslims as someone who has just landed in the country from nowhere. But that is not the case. This is just because of the power hunger, just to maintain. There is a provincial council elections in the cards, and a lot of Muslims movements been banned, and even recently ministers and former governor was taken on charges. And all these recent ad hoc actions by the government make the Muslims worries how the government can target only the minority Muslims in this way and bring more anger, and cohesiveness is lost. So it is very concerning for Muslims over in Sri Lanka and international Muslim communities who are living globally and looking at this in a very serious way. And we don't want to see another Rohingya coming up in Sri Lanka.
Indeed. And Ruwan, on that issue then of societal cohesion, as Shakir there correctly pointed out, I mean, this sort of goes against national security in many ways, right? Because if you otherize, if I may use that term, a whole community within your country and your own citizens in some ways, then that in fact creates, and fosters more possibility, in fact, of extremism, radicalization, right? Because a group under pressure will at some point in time react, won't they?
Sri Lanka, of all places, all countries, understands how marginalising any community can then lead to a further fractured society. It understands that. It's understood that since the Singular Only Act was introduced all those years ago, that led to the troubles of 30 plus years. And my colleague and myself, we grew up through those troubled years with family members involved. Actually, family members involved on both sides, because there's this whole issue of nationalism and religious nationalism within Sri Lanka. Number one, flies in the face of Buddhism. And number two, I only wish people in Sri Lanka actually took their own DNA test, because we have far more in common genetically, etc., than anything else. We are the same people. the Muslim communities have lived alongside Sinhalese, Christian, Burqa communities for centuries. In fact, thousands of the peoples have lived there for thousands of years. This is absolutely ridiculous approach it's taken, and it will lead to further marginalization and further discrimination. The lessons of history, both from the West and from South Asia, are known to us all, and we know what the outcome of this form of discrimination is going to lead to.
Very well. Shakir, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. What is going to happen next, you think, on the part of your organization and other such organizations around the world? Is there now an effort to try to, bring the government to account, to try to understand exactly, what's happening and to stop these sorts of bans as well as these sorts of measures within the country?
Yes, it's a very good question at the moment. And as you know, that international community played a major role in bringing a resolution to the forced cremation matter. There were national and international pressure on the government. But the same way that we believe the international community and as Cosmos, as an organization, as an umbrella body in UK, we also want to see some sort of proper consultations within the community, before making some ad hoc and enforced changes into this kind of practices. So we want the international community to understand, and it might even bring a bad image to Sri Lanka. And we don't want, as a peace-loving Sri Lankans, we want to see how best that we can contribute and live peacefully in Sri Lanka. So therefore, international community and the national governments and politicians and even majority Sinhalese community also echo with this rush on these issues without any proper consultations. And I hope that government will take proper actions and remedial actions in order to avoid confusions and banning these things.
Well, we'll leave that as a final word, but we really appreciate both of our guests, Ruwan and Shakir, for taking their time out of their respective busy schedules to share their expertise and insight with us. We were discussing there Sri Lanka, its decision to ban the burqa, at least the cabinet so far having passed that. And this will, for all intents and purposes, pass by the government as well, considering it does have a majority in all the seats of power at this point in time. This is all coming because the government says it needs to ensure national security. The Minister of Public Safety has, as we've mentioned, has called burqas a sign of religious extremism. Are they really, especially on the part of those women who choose to wear the burqa freely? Isn't it their right to A, choose what to wear, and B, if the concern really is that of national security, marginalizing a whole community is probably not the best way to go about societal cohesion as well as national security, in fact. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss the word apartheid as is used to describe the occupied territories and Israeli actions within the occupied territories. Not too long ago, the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem had come to the conclusion as well that what's occurring in the occupied territories is in fact apartheid. And now we've had Human Rights Watch also releasing a 213-page report coming to a similar conclusion, saying that what Israel is committing is crimes of apartheid and persecution against Palestinians. It discusses things such as land grabs, such as discrimination against Palestinians on a daily basis, and of course goes into great detail, a lot more than I'm able to give in just this very short introduction. The Israelis, as one would expect, have of course come out and denied this and said that this is patently false. Of course, I'm paraphrasing their words. But nevertheless, with these chorus of voices, if I might call them that, on the parts of human rights groups, rising, will this give Israel pause to possibly reconsider some of its policies, at least, towards Palestinians in the occupied territories? Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Niamh Gordon, who is a professor of international law at the School of Law at Queen Mary University of London. He's also the author of Israel's Occupation. He's joining us today from London. Joining us today from Jerusalem is Alan Abbey, who is a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. And joining us this morning from Ottawa is Dr. Nahla Abdou, who is a professor of sociology and anthropology at Carleton University. Nahla, Alan, and Neve. Thank you to all three of you for your time today. Nahla, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What does this sort of terminology represent at this point in time? The fact that one by one these groups are coming to the same conclusion.
I must start actually by saying that finally some international organizations have come to what the Palestinians have been talking about since the establishment of the State of Israel. This state actually started and was built on exclusivity as well as exclusion, by excluding actually the indigenous population there, beginning 1948, where you have more than 80% actually of the Palestinians being kicked out of their homes, of their land, and their homes and land were, of course, literally stolen actually by Israel and the Israelis. And since then, Israel never stopped occupying more and more and more lands. Now, for a settler colonial state like Israel, from the beginning until today, to talk about apartheid there is the least one can say actually in terms of the actual policies and politics of the state towards the Palestinians. Palestinians both as its own citizens, if you want, because over 20% of the Palestinians of Israeli citizens are Palestinians. And, I refuse the term Arabs. Yes, they are Arabs, but the term Arabs alone is not identifiable, right, because you have Arabs all over the Arab world. So I'm saying that I'm glad that finally Human Rights Watch is talking about the reality of the Israeli policies towards the Palestinians, total exclusion as well as you said, confiscation of land to begin with.
All right, so Neve, what are your thoughts about such a report at this time? A, when it comes to the timing of it, and B, as I said, going back to the B'Tselem report as well, I mean, it seems ever so slowly there's a slow recognition of this?
Absolutely. So, I mean, we have to see this not only as a follow-up to the B'Tselem report, but El Haq, the Palestinian human rights organization, has been saying that Israel's an apartheid for some time. And Richard Falk, the special rapporteur for the United Nations, came out with a very long report saying the same thing. And the reason these organizations have been saying that Israel is an apartheid regime is very straightforward, because what they've managed to show in all these reports is that Israel has established a regime of institutionalized discrimination, especially on grounds of race or ethnicity. And we can see it in the West Bank, for example, where we have both Palestinians and Jewish settlers living in the same space, yet they are living under two different legal regimes. So it would be a situation where you and I, for example, were neighbors. You'd live across the street from me, but one legal regime, a civil legal regime, would apply to me because I'm a Jewish Israeli citizen, and a military legal regime would apply to you. Under this military legal regime, if you're charged with committing a violation, you would be brought to a military court. I would be brought to a civil court in Israel. Right. In the military court, 97% of the allegations or the defendants are found to be guilty. In Israel, it's very different. So I think what you see here is the culmination of institutionalized discrimination, and its timing, as you asked, is also very important. Okay. We have the boycott this boycott sanctions movement is claiming that the civil society should boycott Israel, and this kind of echoes the apartheid regime and the kind of civil society strategies that were used against it.
Okay, so Alan, to bring you on the conversation, and I know that there will probably be a debate about the terminology or the term apartheid, but even on the point of just discrimination and land grab, or however we want to term that, I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because as Neve there pointed out, Nahla pointed out, I mean, these two peoples, even though sometimes they may be living, technically side by side, live two very different existences, don't they?
Yes, they do. But let's step back a second. First of all, for me, the use of the term apartheid, which Human Rights Watch has hardly ever applied anywhere else, is designed to be as explosive and tendentious as possible, and to obscure the nuances of the issues and the story, and to essentially provide no way out. If you go through the report, all it says is that it doesn't offer any outs. It doesn't offer any solution to this situation. It simply talks about the fact that Israel is an apartheid state, and it doesn't address real issues in the sense of finding a path for greater freedom and independence for Palestinians in the occupied territories.
All right, so then if I may stick with you for a moment, Alan, how do you think Israel should respond? Because, I mean, if it's just a question of, debate on the term and apartheid, I mean, if we're put that to aside for a moment and just talk about the issues at hand, I mean, these are extremely important issues which do need to be tackled, certainly, don't they?
Internally regarding its political future, and while there are many issues on the table, certainly the future of Israeli relations with Palestinians are one of those. And if you will note that many Israelis, I think a majority of Israelis, want to change the Israeli government, both for its internal and many of its external policies. So that, plus the ongoing efforts by NGOs and individual citizens and grassroots efforts, which are far beyond either the crippled Israeli political system or the ineffectual and corruption-ridden Palestinian Authority, I think you'll find that the people on the ground are farther ahead than their political leaders, and that their efforts are starting to bubble up. So pressure from the outside to push the term on Israel will not work. I'm sorry, it just won't work. You can call it whatever you like, and you can have your agreement within certain organizations that this is apartheid, but it is not going to have any effect on both the Israeli government or Israelis.
And Nahla, that's not an incorrect point, right? I mean, Israel knows what it's been doing, right, in these years. So, I mean, a terminology in and of itself will not change the reality on the ground. What will change the reality on the ground, do you think, in your opinion?
Well, terminology might not change things on the ground simply because the Israeli obnoxiousness, I have to put it this way, refuse to hear anything other than they need to do what they want to do. And what they want to do is kick every single Palestinian man, woman, and child, actually, out of Palestine, and declaring it a Jewish state as they did a couple of years ago. And this is basically what the aim is. So I don't buy it that, with Human Rights Watch and other, especially the ICC now, let's see what, they come up with in terms of their investigation of crimes against humanity or war crimes that Israel has been committing against the Palestinians. So I don't totally agree, actually, with what the gentleman from Jerusalem was saying. Israel, it's not going to make a difference. Yes, because Israel sees itself beyond and above every single law on earth, international laws as well as other laws. It's not because, the term is hurting. Nothing hurts Israel. Israel hurts, actually, the indigenous people day and night. And by all means. So what is going to change it? is literally put major pressure on it. I mean, Biden is one of these people who can put pressure on Israel. Israel literally survives from the billions of dollars it gets from the U.S. every single year. So there must be, a way that the West knows how to stop Israel and stop the crimes that it has been committing. Otherwise, Israel does not listen to any law. Israel is beyond actually the law. So.
Okay. I'm gonna cut. I do apologize. I do sincerely apologize. Unfortunately, we're getting quickly running out of time. So I wanted to give Neve and Alan both a chance for final words. And Neve, on the point that Nahla there was making about what happens on the ground, the realities on the ground, how exactly to affect that. I wanted to get your thoughts on that as well.
In some ways, I even agree with Alan on this. I think the Human Rights Watch recommendations are insufficient. I think the reality on the ground is that there's a one-state situation, and that state is an apartheid regime, and that means that there needs to be a paradigm shift in the international arena. The international arena has been the international leaders have been continuously treating it as a kind of two-state solution. I think, and trying to separate the two parties and create supposedly two states. I don't think they've actually tried that, but that's the paradigm, the two states. I think on the ground it is one state. It is a one-state apartheid reality, and now we need to begin thinking, how do we democratize that one state? What kind of solutions can we introduce to create that one-state reality that is today an apartheid regime into a democratic regime?
And the final word then to you, how does one then come to that reality of democratic state for all peoples equally?
First of all, I think if you go dig deeper into some of the other comments in the report by Human Rights Watch, you essentially are calling for the establishment, the taking apart of the state of Israel, and I'm just going to tell you they're just not going to happen. And I think if you again, I think Palestinians need to have their own voice. I don't know that the Palestinian public wants to be part of one state. Either it's a purely Palestinian Arab state with no Jews, or it's two states which are, one is primarily Jewish and one is primarily Arab. As you and I have discussed before, the failure of multinational states in this part of the world, and I don't see a multinational state like this occurring because I don't think anybody on the ground really wants it. There are a number of external parties that seem to do, intellectuals and such as the like, but I think people want to have their own countries, and as we've seen in the breakup of other multinational states in the rest of the world in recent years, the individuals and if you want to have their own countries. Now, that again has to come from on the ground. The Palestinian Authority has to increase its own democratic activities, as does the State of Israel. And I think that to ask for a single state is, again, a non-starter with the vast majority of people in this region, whether they are Israeli, Arab, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, or English-speaking or Arabic-speaking.
All righty. We'll leave it there at that then. We really appreciate Alan, Neve, and Nahla for taking their time out of their busy schedules to speak to us today. Neve was speaking to us from London, Alan was speaking to us from Jerusalem, and Nahla was joining us this morning from Ottawa in Canada. We were discussing there the Human Rights Watch report, which has said that what Israel is carrying out in the occupied territories are acts of apartheid, or crimes of apartheid, as it's termed it, as well as persecution against Palestinians. Not first human rights organization to come to this conclusion, B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization, also came to a similar conclusion not too long ago. And as Neve there mentioned, the Al-Haq human rights group, the Palestinian human rights group, has also used the term apartheid to describe what Israel is doing to Palestinians in the occupied territories. Is the terminology important? As Alan said, will this actually change the reality on the ground? It probably will not. I mean, the Israelis have already rejected the report altogether, but nevertheless, there is still a very important need to talk about the issues that were brought up in this report, point by point. point. Discrimination when it comes to land, discrimination when it comes to a whole host of other issues that I can't even list here. I don't have the time to list here. It's a 213-page report. But it's very important to go through that, and it's important to have all countries in the world held to an equal standard, and no one country should be held above the law at any point in time. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss algorithms. And, ever since algorithms have come out, ever since we've had social media giants such as Facebook, YouTube, and others, there's always been the issue of algorithms and what content becomes viral. But then beyond that now, there's now the entire issue of artificial intelligence, facial recognition technology, and then the algorithms that are fed into those respective technologies being full of bias because of the people that have in fact put those programs in and or those codes into those respective mediums as well. And this issue has been growing to the extent now that we've had the U.S. Senate. We've had a hearing at the U.S. Senate about algorithms and amplification, where we've had executives from a number of tech giants such as YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook discussing the use of this sort of technology. Of course, within the context of bias, but then B, also just within the context of what sort of content is suppressed and what sort of content is highlighted according to the algorithms of these respective mediums. And as we well know, algorithms are, or they try to keep it a secret, these respective companies, so that they have, some sort of an advantage over their competitors. But nevertheless, possibly it is time to regulate that to an extent so that we do have an equal playing field across the board, and as well as, of course, one free of bias, certainly. Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. I joined Dr. Andrew Selepak, who is a program coordinator for the master's program with a specialization in social media. He's also a lecturer at the Department of Telecommunications at the University of Florida. He is joining us this morning from Gainesville, Florida. Andrew, good morning, and thank you for joining us. I know there's a lot, it's quite a vast, field, obviously, to discuss algorithms, but just overall, they are important for social media giants, aren't they? But how does one then go about logically sort of regulating this sort of thing?
Well, remember, it wasn't that long ago when the social media platforms weren't actually kind of based on this pure algorithm in terms of what the audience would see. The timelines instead were done in chronological order. If you were to go on to Parler, that's still how their timeline is done. The algorithm is something that's kind of developed naturally because for these social media platforms, what they want is for people to spend time on the platforms. So instead of giving them content in chronological order, they want to give them content that they believe based on other users, based on your past experience, based on what's getting engagement, based on what you're engaging with, that will keep you on the platform and keep you engaged, because the things higher up in your timeline are going to be the content that AI, their algorithm, and your previous experience with the platform have determined or are guessing that you're most likely to engage with. So this is really something that's now baked into every one of these platforms. This algorithm, as you mentioned, proprietary, we don't have a complete understanding of it. We haven't looked completely under the hood in terms of how they work. This is how these platforms keep us on there. This is how the platforms keep us scrolling, keep us engaged, keep us going back, rather than the older model of that chronological order.
Are these companies in some ways, because I know that argument was made not too long ago as well, and we may have discussed this as well, are these companies simply too big? As in the fact that they're so hard to regulate at this point, and that they've been given such a free hand now, and then for us now to go backwards and try to regulate their algorithms, regulate the fact that they are, of course, businesses, as you correctly pointed out, and they do want to ensure that they make money. They have us remain on their respective platforms for as long as possible. That's not necessarily good for society, though, right? I mean, in the sense of we're talking about Christchurch, terrorist attack, or other such content which is undesirable.
A point in time where I think social media is, because they're under so much additional pressure, they're trying to do something. Now, I'm not letting them off the hook there by any means, but I think they have seen that there's a lot more pressure on them from governments around the world in terms of what content is allowed, when content is blocked, who gets deplatformed. But then we still have things like shadow banning that it's difficult sometimes to even determine if it's happened. So the issue that we have is these companies are exceedingly powerful. I would say Facebook is more powerful than probably any country in the world with its number of users and the impact that it can have by what content gets placed higher in timelines, how this information can be used to anger an audience, how this information can be used to pacify an audience. But we have seen them attempting, at least sort of since the pandemic, that they've been trying to do more when it comes to what information is actually seen. Google's done a lot in terms of saying these are the reputable sources. If you looked up the word coronavirus, these are the information and facts that we believe that you should have, rather than finding some individual's blog or website where they're explaining coronavirus and how it's caused by this or that, literally debunked stories, because people were finding that kind of information previously. We've seen that these social media platforms have done this when it related to not just the coronavirus, but when it's occurred with other sort of traumatic or really groundbreaking events. This happened just recently with the Derek Chauvin trial, and what information Facebook was allowing to be higher up in people's algorithm when they were going onto the platform. So. Yeah. I think what we have is that these platforms are now kind of in an odd position because this has become such a political issue that they almost want to do more when it comes to trying to regulate the content being seen. But they know that in doing this, they're now going to be questioned by people on the left and the right as to, well, why did this content get seen? Why was this individual deplatformed? And they've hit a situation now where, because they have been allowed to kind of do whatever they wanted for so many years, when they try to do anything, there's going to be questions, because this is now such a hugely political issue, whether it's here in the United States or literally around the world.
Now, I know you mentioned earlier that possibly a lot of regulation may not be the correct thing to do, but at the same time, I'm thinking that it would be nice to have, for example, these Western countries, I'm talking about the likes of the UK, US, and others, lead by example, right? And how we can use AI, but in a responsible fashion. So, I mean, within AI, I know that even banks are now looking into using AI to give out mortgages, good or bad, depending on, what the results are of that vis-a-vis people of color or people who are living in marginalized communities, et cetera. Those are really important issues, right? Because those also then go to the heart of the American dream, if I may call it that everybody is equal and then everybody gets a chance at succeeding. But if the AI in and of itself has decided that you should be getting a bad mortgage, or that you are not to be trusted for whatever reason because of the color of your skin, et cetera. I mean, I know that there was a recent study done even with members of Congress, if I'm not mistaken, and a number of members of Congress who are people of color were found to have possibly criminal, backgrounds, just again because of their skin color and or tone. Those are all troubling signs, aren't they, for AI?
Well, the thing with AI, again, is it's still a relatively new technology, and it's going to have issues. Now, that doesn't excuse the issues depending on how it's applied. If AI is something that is sort of being tested, then it's probably okay. But once it starts actually making real decisions for individuals, now we've seen that AI is being used to determine who should be hired. AI is being used at airports. You go into an airport now, and they're going to be using biometric data of using a scan of your face as it relates to your passport. So it is something that we know is growing. This is not just, do you want to tag a friend on a Facebook post or a Facebook image, but this is being used by companies for a lot of things. And for that reason, yes, I think it is something that we should be very concerned with. However, it kind of goes back to social media. It depends on what you look at with social media or with any technology. Is it the potential? Is it the utopian view of what it could be? Or is it the dystopian view of what it could be used for? And there's obviously problems because of the technology being new. There's been a number of problems in terms of how this technology has been taught and the individuals who have been used to teach this technology to engage in facial recognition. There's been comments and questions and problems of this for years now, that mostly the people that have been used as the examples to help AI learn faces has been from people who have European background. And for that reason, it's not been as good with literally any other group. But some of that comes from the fact that it just needs to learn. I mean, we're talking about a tool to a certain extent. I don't want to go down the road of a dystopian robot, but we're looking at a tool that needs to be developed and needs to learn. And some of that needs to come from these companies that are building it, that are creating it, and making sure that individuals of a variety of backgrounds, racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, need to be observed, they need to be scanned. But some of that then comes from the fact that when we start looking at this technology and we start talking about its potential for these, again, dystopian uses, I think a lot of people are very hesitant about it because they don't understand the technology.
Indeed, that's actually a very good point, because as a final word, I wanted to talk about those who actually understand this technology and those who don't, right? So I know not too long ago, I believe it was Mark Zuckerberg, if I'm not mistaken, who was in front of a committee of lawmakers, and he was asked very basic questions about Facebook, like extremely basic, the stuff that, you know, a lot of us in fact found comical, that a lawmaker would be asking such a basic question sitting on a committee which is meant to be looking into Facebook's activities. So I wonder then, are we depending on people who are, I hate to use the word ignorant, but possibly ignorant really on how these platforms work? In fact, is this a question of needing to educate lawmakers first and then having them figure out how to exactly logically regulate these platforms?
So I'm 100% a firm believer that the idea of media literacy and social media literacy is very lacking across the board for everyone. Whether I'm in the classroom explaining these things to my students or, you know, engaging this type of conversation with anyone, there is an extreme lack of understanding of how these platforms work, how they operate, the information that they're collecting on us, how that information is being used. And those are, as you're mentioning, a lot simpler things than how AI works. You know, we haven't even gotten into, we're looking at AI right now as sort of facial recognition and biometric data. But this conversation hasn't even discussed deep fakes, the potential of deep fakes, how deep fakes could overthrow a government and cause civil unrest and riots and death. So this technology is going to have a lot of implications. And the fact that even on some very basic levels, most users, and you think about the over 2.7 billion people on Facebook, an overwhelming majority of them don't understand how Facebook works, how Facebook is collecting information off of them, profiting off of them, and how the content that they're seeing is influencing them. Then when you move it to an even more complicated area like artificial intelligence, it's far beyond what many people can understand. And a lot of that needs to begin with education and informing people. How that's going to be done, I think, is the biggest question. If it's going to be done through education, if there is some means to kind of teach people about it, because clearly leaving them up to their own devices and the personal responsibility of it has been lacking when people can so easily start an account, they're happy to use it, don't really think about the implications of it.
Indeed, and that's a very pertinent point to end it on. We really appreciate, once again, your time this morning, Andrew. That was Andrew Selpak speaking there from Gainesville, Florida. We're discussing algorithms, bias within algorithms. Beyond that, just question of bias, there's also the question of what content gets seen, what content gets lowered down our respective timelines and feeds. These companies, as Andrew there said, they are businesses. They want us to remain on their platforms for as long as possible, so they'll continue to show us content which they believe will keep us engaged on the respective platforms, especially the likes of YouTube and others, but even the likes of Facebook also. That's problematic still, because if we are looking at extremist content of any sort or fake news of any sort, and we keep getting that sort of fed back to us over and over again through the other suggested content, that's problematic, certainly. And then beyond that, of course, is the entire new world of AI and the use of facial recognition technology, the use of just coded bias really within these programs, hiring practices, mortgage practices, etc. This is an entire world that needs to be regulated in some logical fashion. A, understood, as we discussed there at the end, and B, then regulated in some logical fashion as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.